Others say that ditching the exam could have a negative consequence. Joining me to have that discussion in our Google Hangout is Billy Whelan. He's Managing Director of Sentia Education. I'm also joined by Dr. Camille Charles, Professor of Sociology and Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. We're joined by Jeff Olson, who's Vice President of Research at Kaplan Test Prep. And we are joined by HuffPost's own Associate Producer, the legendary Colleen Stuffelman. Thank you for being here. I'm going to start with Dr. Charles. Dr. Charles, there are so many people who say that it's about time we got rid of this SAT, that it serves no purpose. Is that true?
Well, I think it depends on your perspective. So from the perspective of admissions officers, right, it serves an important function by sort of creating a floor for admissions, because you could say, well, if you score below a certain level, we really don't think you can do the work here. On the other hand, from the perspective of the students, there are certain populations of students who historically have not necessarily tested as well, and research is beginning to show that in some instances, those test scores aren't actually the best predictors of what they're able to do in terms of college level work. So for some student populations, the SAT or the ACT become a barrier to admissions to certain schools, in spite of maybe having an excellent profile in terms of grade point average, letters of recommendation, honors, and those kinds of things. On the other hand, again, for admissions offices, they can be important. And because we have traditionally relied on the SAT, we now come to think of it as a measure of intelligence and ability. It's important in the U.S. News and World Report's rankings of colleges and universities. And so in some ways, I think the general population is going to look at which schools and what kind of schools are eliminating the SAT or the ACT or changing how heavily they rely on those things. And that's going to be the bigger indicator of, you know, how many people jump on the bandwagon.
So you mentioned something that's really interesting, because I think people don't know what the SAT is supposed to measure. The average person thinks that you take the SAT and you figure out how smart someone is, and then you figure out that if they're sufficiently smart, I let them into my school. But the SAT actually isn't designed to figure out how smart someone is, right? It's designed to determine how prepared they are for college, right?
Well, and our Jeff may want to speak to this a little bit more specifically, but right, it is not an IQ test. So it in some ways, some argue that it actually is a measure of how well someone prepared to take that particular test. So that if you've had prep courses, or if you're in a school that includes kind of how to take those kinds of tests, then you'll score better on those tests. But it is also there are class-based differences. There are certain kinds of knowledge. But in large part, I think what happens is, if you're in under-resourced public schools, for example, you're not going to have access to the teachers and resources that are going to prepare you for the things that are on the SAT and the ACT. It's not a be-all, end-all in terms of what someone is capable of doing, and it really is a snapshot at a moment in time. At the end of the day, in the work that I've done at least, students' high school GPA ends up being a better longer-term predictor of their grades and their performance in college. The SAT scores start to peter out after the first term or the first year of college in terms of predicting grades. Again, that doesn't mean that they don't measure anything, and it doesn't mean that they don't matter, but it certainly could mean that we don't have to put as much emphasis on them as we have traditionally. And I agree with you, and I'm glad that there are best practices there. And I just think that often what happens with sort of what we would like to do and what best practices are, and then what ends up happening as decisions are being made, again, particularly at places that are seeing, 20,000 applications, can be very different. And so while people are well-intentioned and they know what best practices are and all of those things, I do think that there are circumstances where you do have that kid that on all other measures or indicators looks like an awesome applicant, and people on the committee take pause because of the SAT scores, because again, society has put more stock into those tests than is appropriate, because, as Jeff said, they tell us something, but they don't tell us everything.
So Camille,
unfortunately,
let me give you a hypothetical, Camille. Let me give you a hypothetical, and all of you, actually, I want to jump in. I'm going to start with Camille, though. If, say there's a student who was class president, involved in community activities, never had a behavior problem in school, had glowing letters of recommendation, but was in like the 10th percentile or the 20th percentile on their SAT score. Help me understand, what are some possibilities for why they could be so glowing in other areas of their life, be getting A's, and they may have a 3.8 GPA, but still not do well in this test? I've heard Colleen say one thing about dyslexia, maybe learning challenges. What are some other possibilities?
I mean, there's also just a sort of generalized test anxiety. I think if you look at Claude Steele's work and his student Aronson's work on social identity threat, so that women can be primed and perform poorly on math tests. Athletes in thinking positions can be primed and then suddenly perform poorly in the natural athletic kinds of tasks, when otherwise they wouldn't perform any differently. There's a lot of documentation for stereotype threat for racial minorities, and in fact for Asians it can be a kind of reverse effect where, because they're expected to do so well, they end up choking on the exam. And that happens not only with standardized testing, but it can happen in the classroom once those students get to colleges and universities. Because again, it's this sort of total intellectual environment. And if the stereotype of your group is one of anti-intellectualism, they're constantly trying to fight against that stereotype. And the truth is, they don't have to be conscious of those feelings. The only thing they have to be conscious of is the existence of that negative stereotype about them. And so, but other people just have test anxiety, and there's so much pressure to perform well on the test, and it seems like everything about the rest of my life is tied up in this standardized test, and that can cause them to perform poorly relative to what any other indicator might suggest that they would do on the test. And certainly taking the test multiple times can help, because you can kind of desensitize yourself to the pressure of the test, and you can improve your scores over time, but that costs money. And some of the populations we're talking about don't have the resources to take the test multiple times, or to take a Kaplan class where they learn tricks, where they are exposed to several practice tests and are able to kind of desensitize themselves to those things. And that's not Kaplan's fault, that's not ETS's fault, that's a larger societal problem. And for me, it's just that you can't talk about one without talking about the other.
A lot of our collective anxiety and frustration with the test, and Camille, I'll let you jump in, is about that old model, because I think the first thing I thought about was, the stuff I did in college freshman, sophomore year had nothing to do with what I prepared for the SAT. I learned a bunch of words, I studied vocabulary, and then I got to college and didn't see those words. And when I came across words I didn't know in college, I just looked them up. It wasn't that deep, and I'm not sure that should have been something to stop me from getting into college. But Camille, jump on in.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, in the spirit of full disclosure, I took the SAT when the total score was 1,600. I took the PSAT in 11th grade. I took a prep course, and I scored 1,050. I still graduated from college. I went to one of the top PhD programs in sociology in the country, and I was among the first in my cohort to finish. And I now teach and do research at an Ivy League university. So we can always find these individual cases where, the test didn't really tell you much. I didn't do much better on the GRE. I don't test well.
How'd you do your freshman year of college, though? Was there a connection between that and your freshman year of college?
No, I didn't do as well as I could have, but it was not about not knowing the material.
Right.
My parents are going to see this, so.
Right. We'll cut there.
But it was actually more about not knowing what I wanted to do, but I had to go to college. I applied to one college, Occidental, early decision. I got in, and I didn't think any more about it. But it wasn't really about what I wanted to do or didn't want to do, or what I understood or didn't understand. Certainly, there was some high culture things in my freshman year world cultures class
Yeah.
that, you know, would have been news to me, except that my father took me to Europe. And so I had seen the architecture. So I wouldn't have gotten that stuff in school, nor was it on the SAT.
See, to me, this solves the problem. All these kids in underprivileged neighborhoods, if they would just stop being lazy and go to Europe.
Go to Europe, right.
They figure it all out. Graduate record examination, often used to determine whether people get into master's programs, PhD programs and such, often in the humanities and social sciences. It's a good question, and I wondered that, and not just the GRE, but the LSAT and other things. Dr. Charles, are they more predictive than the SAT?
I can speak to GRE scores with graduate students that, you know, I've been exposed to over my 17 years or so as a professor, and not always. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. Again, I didn't do as badly on the GRE as I did on the SAT, but I also I took the subject test to hedge my bets.
Right.
Because I knew that I was stressed about the regular test, and I knew what my SAT scores had been. And I kind of knew the lay of the land, and so I took the subject test because that was knowledge that I actually had. I was a sociology major, and I could do better on that test. But certainly sometimes we get students with high GRE scores, and they are, you know, they're brilliant, but everything else about their files showed us their brilliance as well. I think more often we get these students who look brilliant in every other way, and the GRE scores, again, are lackluster, and it's about making decisions about, you know, are you willing to take a chance on this student? And I think you have more opportunities in graduate school and PhD programs because there are fewer applicants. But again, you get to the MCATs, the LSATs, and things for professional schools, and there are so many applicants, again, that it would be impossible, I think, for certain institutions in particular, to take the holistic approach that everyone would prefer. Right. I mean, the applicants would prefer it, the admissions people would prefer it, because you could really craft a class around knowing more about individuals and the way that we sort of feel as Americans it ought to be. It just can't.
And maybe I'm biased. I mean, when it comes to GREs in particular, I tend to...
I would say two things. One is going test optional, I think, is a way psychologically for admissions offices to place a little less emphasis on the test, because most students are probably still submitting their test scores. I mean, again, it is part of our national culture now. It's what we do. Right. But it takes some of the pressure off, I think. It allows admissions officers in their meetings to say, okay, we can place less importance on this. It doesn't have to be the kind of centerpiece of the admissions file. And I think that's important, because I think that opens, you know, that opens admissions officers' kind of evaluations up to look more at some of those other pieces of information than they might have otherwise. I think the other thing, getting back to the comment that came in, is that people measure quality differently. So for this particular person who just tweeted in that the quality of students has gone up, it may be because they're getting students that he thinks are now from more diverse backgrounds and more interesting and have more varied life experiences than they were getting before. And that's what he values in terms of quality, where there are certainly plenty of people out there who really think about quality in terms of GPA, test scores, and AP courses. And that the highest quality students are the ones with the highest GPAs, the highest test scores, and the most AP credits coming in. So one of the things we have to think about is how you measure diversity, how you measure quality, and what you mean when you use that, because we're not all having the same conversation.
No, absolutely. That's a powerful point.